Today I'm going to show you guys how to paint the planters or the pots and the cast shadows coming off of those plants. We're going to be largely using one color today. It's going to be the indigo blue, so that should be a new color that's been added to your palette if you haven't had it or gotten it yet. So the first thing you guys need to do is you're going to need to take the caps off of your round brushes. We are largely going to use the number 6 round brush for most of this, but you're going to use the small thin number 1 round brush at the end, and then we'll probably use the flat brush for the cast shadows. So make sure you put the caps in the backs and you zip those up so you don't lose those. You should have also 2 in front of you guys. Obviously your project, your sketchbook, a bucket of water, your palette with your paints, primarily indigo blue, and then a paper towel. Make sure that you do have your sketchbook turned to the page that has that tracing on it. We're going to use that information from that tracing paper for today, and then you're also going to use the sketchbook to test out any of your colors and washes that you're going to make today before you paint them down on your painting. So always good to have your sketchbook out so you can test out those colors before you use them. All right, so make sure you got all your stuff. I never recommend putting your palette directly on top of your painting. That's just asking for trouble. The only reason why I do that is because it all fits on the screen better. So let's talk about the cast shadows and the shadows on the pots. So when I'm discussing this with you guys, you need to make sure that you're looking at your still life so you can see what I'm talking about. So make sure that you're looking at your still life. So our goal for the planters specifically is to make them look three-dimensional. So one of the things that you need to first sort of get set in your mind is where your light is coming from. So my light is coming from the left side. Now again, your light is probably coming from a different direction. So make a note of that. You are not doing necessarily what I'm doing. You're doing what you see needs to be done on your still life. So my light's coming from the left, okay? So it's hitting the left side of my still life and all my objects. And so that's where the lightest areas are going to be on my plant, the planters, and the paper. And then you'll notice that as I go around or sort of go to the other side of the planter, things get darker. So on my left side of my pot is the lightest, on the corner is a little bit darker, and then on the other side of my pot is darkest. So I kind of have like 3 levels there: light, medium, and dark. The other thing that you're probably going to notice too is you guys can see at the top of your planter, your pot, is again a different value there on the top. Again, it's important to understand that as the form changes, the value should change also too. And this is the key in making your planters and everything on our still life look three-dimensional. So again, for every form change, there needs to be a value change. And we cannot forget about the top rim of our planters either. So that's an important thing to keep in mind too, is just notice how the light or the shadow changes on that top edge versus the side of the planter. The other thing you're going to notice also too is some of that reflective red that is shining on your pots. You're going to see that a lot at the bottom of your pots where the planter and the construction paper are close to each other. So you're going to see that red kind of reflecting on those areas of the pots where the pot is close to the paper. We'll paint that in also too today. Now just make sure, double check that your pencil lines on your drawing have been lightened. And again, you can really see mine, they're pretty obvious just because, again, I drew my pencil lines pretty dark, and then even when I try to erase them, they're still there. So again, another good lesson in making sure that when you do your drawing, you always do your draw your drawing very lightly with your pencil. Again, another thing to take note too is sort of value changes that happen from the bottom of your pot to the top of it. Again, you're going to see more of that red reflecting at the bottom of your pots than you do at the top. And that's just because the bottom is where it's close to that paper. So a lot of this today that we're going to be doing is going to be based on wet versus dry paper. So for the most part, all of today is going to be, our goal is to paint on dry paper. We want to keep the edges of our pots really defined. We don't want them to get fuzzy, and we don't want them to certainly blur into other parts of our painting. So we want to make sure that we're painting on dry paper. So I'm primarily going to be using indigo blue all of today for this step. We're going to also be dealing with our cast shadows. So remember, on your cast shadows, they're not just one solid value. They change from beginning to end. So we want to make sure that we can establish variation within them. Now, as far as where that variation needs to happen, remember that a cast shadow is going to be darkest towards the object that's making that cast shadow. And the cast shadow then is going to lighten as it stretches farther away from that object. And again, the color that we're going to use for our shadow is going to be that indigo blue. So it's important to just make sure, if you are starting this step on a different day or not with the rest of us, make sure that for the most part your entire painting is dry. You do not want to start working on painting the shadows on the pots if areas around there are wet. So make sure you have all your stuff. You need your bucket of clean water. You need your palette, your paper towel, and obviously painting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by making a wash of this indigo blue. So I'm going to start with about 4 scoopfuls or brushfuls of clean water in a new paint well. So I just want to, I don't know. I think there's about 4 brushfuls of water in there. And then I'm just going to take a really small amount of that indigo blue, tiny amount because it is a strong color. I'm going to mix it in with that water. My hope is that I'm going to get sort of a light wash of that indigo blue. Now I've got my palette on top of my painting. I do not recommend doing this. This is just asking for something to happen. I'm only doing that just because of the video. So I'm going to take this wash that I made and I'm going to test it out in my sketchbook just to see what it looks like before I use it. Looks like it's pretty light, so I'm going to go ahead and start with this. I will eventually be making darker versions of this wash to add more contrast, but this is a good place to start. So this will be the wash I'm going to use to kind of help me map out where my shadows are. So I'm going to start on that front large plant first, just like what we've done for this entire project. And I'm going to go ahead and take this light wash of indigo blue and paint it over the entire side of my pot that needs to be dark. So this whole side's going to be dark. There's no part of this going to be white or remain white. So I might as well just take this light wash of indigo blue and just kind of fill this side. Again, I am avoiding, if you take a look at this, I am avoiding the corner of my pot. So I'm not painting that curved corner that I've got drawn in, and I'm not painting the top edge or rim of the vessel. I'm just painting the side. And again, if any part of this painting around this area was wet, all of this indigo blue that I'd be painting right now would be kind of spilling out into other areas. So it's important that you're painting on dry paper. So I've got that painted in. And you can see that on the right side of all of my pots, those are the darkest sides of my pot. So I'm going to go ahead and paint this light wash of indigo blue on that right side of all of my pots. Now again, your dark side might be on the left. So pay attention to what your still life is telling you to do. And again, I did not paint that top rim, and I did not paint that curved corner of the planter or pot, whatever you want to call it. So what I'm going to do now is just make another wash. I'm taking some of the water. I put about, I think, 3 brushfuls of clean water, well, somewhat clean water into a new paint well. And I'm going to add just a little bit more of the indigo blue this time to make a wash that's a bit darker. So I'm looking for like 1 to 2 steps darker. So while this side of the pot is wet, I'm going to go ahead and lay down a darker wash in the areas that need to be darker while this side is wet, so it blends out. And again, I'm only going to put this darker indigo blue where it needs to start to darken on my painting. So again, I'm looking at my still life for the answers. So again, you shouldn't necessarily be doing exactly what I'm doing. You should be doing what your still life is telling you that you need to do. So I'm only going to put that darker wash of indigo blue where it needs to go. And then if you can see, I'm kind of getting some hard edges there. If I need to blend out, I'm going to wash my brush off, get a little bit of just plain water on that brush and kind of just blend it out on the painting itself. By just kind of gently painting over top that area that needs to blend. Again, I could kind of give you tips and tricks on how to blend watercolors and even acrylics or any kind of paint, but really you're not going to learn how to do that until you give it a go yourself. So there's a definitely, half of it is just kind of doing it yourself and figuring it out. So I'm just going to keep building up, adding some variation on this side of the pot. So that hopefully when I'm finished with this particular area, I have a couple values that I'm showing. Now again, my goal is to ultimately end up with maybe 4 or 5 different values on this particular, overall on the whole pot, but this is a good place to start. So I'm just going to get a couple different values established first. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the other 2 planters and do the same thing. Again, each planter is a little different, so the shadows aren't even, there isn't the same amount of dark on each pot. The shapes that the shadows are making on the pots are different on each one of them, so you need to make sure that you're paying attention to what your still life is telling you that you need to do. This particular planter or pot that I'm working on right now, this side is pretty dark. So it'll eventually get built up once I kind of get comfortable with what I'm doing and what I need to do. There are a lot of artists out there who will a lot of times start with their darkest values first, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think there's a lot of value in doing it that way. But I'm a little bit of what I would describe as a scaredy cat, so I like to gradually build up my values, and I feel like for me that works better for me. Everybody's different, so again, if you want to start with your darker values, I'm not going to hold you back from doing that, so do whatever you feel works best for you. Again, I do not recommend keeping your palette directly on top of your painting like I'm doing. The only reason why I'm doing this is just so that you can see it on the video. So once I get a good start on that second one, I'm going to go back and just add a little bit more contrast to the first one that I worked on. So I'm going to be spending here for the next few minutes just kind of going back and forth between all 3 of these planters, just working on the darker side of each one of them. And I still have to get the third one started. So I'm going to go ahead and start that third one, giving those other 2 a chance to kind of dry. There's a certain point where, I've got to start on those. If I keep adding more stuff to it, whatever I add to it's just going to bleed out into that in that area of the wet paper, and I don't necessarily want that to happen. So What I love about watercolor paint is that it really does force you to stop working in areas and go work on other ones. So you do a really good job of kind of moving around your painting so you don't get too stuck in a particular area. If you do allow yourself to get stuck in a particular area of your composition, you're likely to overwork it. So if you notice that happening, listen to what your painting's telling you. Stop, let the paper dry, and move on to something different. So again, I'm just going to keep working back and forth between these three pots. Again, just looking at my still life, and in my situation, my reference photograph. But you guys should be looking at your still life and asking yourself specifically what needs to happen on each one of these pots. Each one is going to be different. So don't get too caught up and start formulating things, making each pot look exactly the same, because they are not. They may be the same pot, but they have different plants on them, and they're in different parts of your still life, so therefore the light is hitting each one of them a little differently. So I'm just going to keep going back and forth between these two washes that I have, building up darker values where I need them to be, and in the process, giving the other areas that I'm working on a chance to dry. Because some of these shadows that I see on the pots do have a specific shape to them. So I want to make sure, again, just because I'm dealing with shadows, it doesn't mean that they automatically blend and transition seamlessly into other values. Sometimes those shadows make really defined shapes, so I need to pay attention to that. That's part of my job. Now, the other thing I want to mention too is that if you accidentally drop or spill any paint in your background area, which we haven't touched yet, I wouldn't worry about it too much. I mean, go ahead and try to pick up the paint if you want to, but we are going to be adding some different colors in the background and adding some variation there. So it's likely that it's going to just get covered up. So I would not worry about that too much. So again, you're going to find yourself having to remix a lot of these washes. So again, take advantage of having your sketchbook near you. Test out those washes before you use them. And when I do end up remixing washes or even paint mixtures, if I'm working with acrylics, I don't make it a big deal if I get it exactly the same, because everything's going to be kind of blending together anyways on the painting. So get close. So I'm going to give those dark sides of the pots a chance to dry. And what I'm going to do is, again, we're going to be working in two different areas. So this is going to be a good lesson in just kind of keeping an eye on your painting. So you will find yourself constantly touching your paper, trying to figure out if it's wet or dry. So I'm going to go ahead and take that light wash of indigo blue, and I'm going to start blocking in my cast shadow. And I'm going to use my flat brush for this just because I'm talking about some larger areas. If your cast shadows maybe are not taking up as much space as mine, maybe using the number 6 round brush would work better for you, but I'm going to go ahead and use the flat brush. So I'm just going to take that lightest wash of indigo blue and black in all those cast shadow shapes that I have drawn in. Now the key with doing this, because we already have the red paint down first and it's dry, is that when you paint this light wash of indigo blue over top these areas, that you don't kind of overbrush or continue to pet the paper. If you do, you are likely going to pick up that red and even pull it out, and then you'll start to see some bare spots. kind of exposing themselves in your painting. So the trick with this is to lay down that wash of indigo blue and just let it go. So get it down, let it go, move on to another area. So this should go quickly. You should not be continuing to brush over a single area over and over and over again, because again, you'll just end up picking up that red and you'll get like kind of a bare spot in a particular area. So the key to getting a nice kind of as flat of a sort of wash or consistent wash as you look that you want is that you just got to lay the color down and let it go. So do not overbrush in areas. And if you do, you'll find out the hard way why that's not a good idea. So, and because I'm working on a large area, I have quite a few large cast shadows. I'm going to have to remix quite a lot of this light wash of indigo blue a few times before I even get all of my cast shadows blocked in. And again, in some of those areas where, the shapes are a little small and it's hard for my flat brush to get into, I'm going to use that number 6 round brush to get into some of those smaller shapes. And again, you can see this new mixture that I made is just slightly darker than what I was using before, but I'm not going to make a big deal out of it. You can kind of see where the edge is. I'm just going to kind of let the wet paper do its thing and fix it for me. So I'm not going to do anything to it. If it's too different, then I can always add a little bit of water to my mixture to lighten it up. But again, I think that's one of the things that's cool about watercolors, where you get those sort of subtle variations just because maybe you have more layers in an area or slightly different variation in the color or the value of it. And you kind of get that kind of water stained look in areas. That's watercolor paint for you. So I think those are some of the really cool things about watercolor paint. We don't want this to necessarily look like an acrylic painting or something different. So it's just part of the territory. Now, again, if you are finding that areas of your painting, like, for example, like you just don't have a lot of definition, perhaps your edges are looking fuzzy and not sharp, or, parts of your painting are blending together, that's a sign that's telling you that you are working on paper or on areas that are too wet to work in. If you're looking for definition, sharp edges, you're looking for defined shapes, you should always be painting on dry paper. And remember, watercolor paint will go wherever the water is. So when I was working on the leaves or the petals, whatever you want to call them, when I was painting them, I could not work on 2 leaves that are right next to each other or overlapping each other, because if I did, they would just kind of bleed and blend together. I had to kind of move around the painting, and you constantly are touching your painting just to check to see how wet or dry your paper is before you do it. So right now I'm trying to finish up plugging in or blocking in my last cast shadow. And this particular one that I'm working on is pretty dark. I just see a small part of it because my front plant is blocking it. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of block that in with my darker wash that I have. There's no need for me to block it in with a light wash when I know that it's going to need to be pretty dark. So I've got that. Another thing too, you guys probably have already figured this out, but just remember that the color looks darker when it's wet, and as the paint dries, it does lighten up. That can be a good thing and a bad thing, depending on what your situation is. So as you can see, I've remixed these mixtures that I've been working with quite a few times. So again, get close. Don't be too hard on yourself getting it perfect, but also make sure that you are testing out your mixtures in your sketchbook first before you start. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to let the cast shadows on the paper dry. So I don't want to do anything else to them right now, because if I do, I could probably start picking up that red, and I don't want that to happen. Now my pot, the area of the pots is pretty dry. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and start going back and working on the pots again. So I'm going to start adding, I'm going to work on some of those sides that I have been ignoring. I've got a cast shadow that actually is shining on my far right planter, so I'm going to go ahead and block in that shape. Again, I'm still avoiding that top rim of the planter and that curved corner of the planters. I haven't done anything with those. Now, even though the left side of my pots are pretty light, they do look like they're getting darker at the bottom just a little bit. So what I'm going to do is take that really light wash of indigo blue, the lightest one I've been using, and I'm just going to put a little bit of it at the bottom of my pots on the lightest side of them. And then I'm just going to use some clean water and just kind of blend that out. So that lightest side of the pots is not exactly all white. Again, because the planters or pots, you notice they kind of get skinnier at the bottom and wider at the top. Because they're skinnier at the bottom, they look like they're getting just there's like a little bit of a shadow at the bottom of them. So I'm going to make sure that I show that. And you got to think about, too, where do you need white to show through? For the most part, I'm going to see white on the top rim in some places, but that's pretty much it. So I just want a barely there indigo blue showing on the lightest side. The other thing, too, that I'm going to try to achieve is to be able to show that curved edge and the top rim of the pot without needing any outlines. Again, outlines do not exist on these pots, so you don't see like kind of a dark outline around these edges. But the reason why you see these edges and these form changes is because there's a contrast in value. So a lot of times if you can't see an edge, you need to ask yourself, which one should be darker? And so there's your answer. Whatever needs to be darker, that's where you need to add a little bit of a shadow. And then you should see where you didn't paint pop out as another edge. So again, you do not want to show edges with outlines. You want to show edges by placing contrasting values next to each other. So again, I'm just going to go back and through, and I'm going to keep working on the pots. I made up now an even darker indigo blue wash, and I'm going to start building up those darker shadows that I need to see on the dark sides of my pots. Again, I think it's good not to get too stuck in certain areas of your painting. If you start to see your paper pilling up, that's a sign that it's telling you you're overworking that particular area. You need to stop, let that paper dry, and move on to something else. If you are laying down paint and it just kind of disappears on you, and that's not what you want, again, the painting's telling you you need to stop working on that area and move on to something different. So my goal at this point is to get like 3 very different values established on the parts of the pots that I've already started painting. Again, I still haven't painted that curved edge or corner, and I haven't painted the top rim of the pot. So those are not part of this particular discussion yet. So I want 3 very different values. The more contrast I can have between my values, the more form I'm likely to show and the more pop I'm going to get. I think a lot of times watercolors get a bad rap, and that a lot of people think the color is just kind of really soft or washed out. And watercolors can have a lot of saturation in them. They can have a lot of pop. They can be very bold. It just all depends on how much water you're mixing with those paints, and, how brave you are in adding those darker values into your painting. So don't be afraid to go for it. So again, you can tell in the video, I just keep touching my paper. I am just testing it out to see if it's dry, if it's wet. And again, the trick to being able to get these planters or pots to look three-dimensional is to remember that for every form change you have, when you go from one side, go around the corner to the other side, there should be a value change that happens with each one of those form changes. That's how you're going to get the form to stand out. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of my lightest red wash that I have. So I'm picking up my palette that has my reds on it. And I need to rehydrate it a little bit. So I'm going to work on getting that light red wash reestablished. And I'm going to go ahead and use that light wash of red and start showing that reflective red that I see popping up on the bottom area or bottom edges of my pots. Now again, I still haven't painted the top rim or that curved corner. I'll do that later. Now, when you're adding this reflective red, I think it is important to make sure that, again, your paper's dry. I don't necessarily want this red that when I put it down on my paper to just go everywhere. I want it to stay where I want it to go. So I'm going to just make sure that the paper's pretty dry. This plant that I have on the far left side, the dark side of it has a lot of red popping on it. So again, this is a good thing to point out, is that reflective red is going to affect and appear differently on each one of your 3 pots. So pay attention to the differences between them. You should not treat them the same. But when you're looking for that reflective color, it's likely going to happen where those 2 objects are close to each other. So I'm going to go through and just add that reflective red. I will go through in the future, I will be going through and making that reflective red louder in areas. But again, I'm just trying to get things kind of started so I can see them, and then I'll play around with stuff. Now what I'm doing, I'm going to let those dark sides of the pots dry, and while that's drying, then I'm going to go ahead and put that reflective red where I see it happening on the light side of my pots. Now this is something you probably learned in Drawing Penny 1. Color is created by reflective light, and because light is reflective, so is color. This is also an important observation that every artist who works in color notices and kind of keys in on, as it's a great way to sort of show your understanding of how color is created, but also it's a great way to create a lot of unity within your composition. So you will always see, colors sort of reflect onto each other. And again, you should, at some point, whether you're drawing or painting, and it doesn't matter what media you're working in, but, about halfway through your work is take a moment to really notice how those colors are, affecting each other. And those reflective opportunities are going to happen where you have two different colored objects near each other. So again, you can see I'm just touching my paper, constantly checking to see if the paper is wet or dry. So I'm going to give my planters and my pots a chance to dry a bit. Again, I'm not going to do those curved edges or those top rims until the two sides that I've been working on are dry. If I do them now, then they'll just bleed into what I've already painted. So I got to make sure that those planters are completely dry before I do those areas. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and work on my cast shadows on the paper. So again, be careful, and as you can see, I'm working on in an area that's right next to the pot. I need to make sure that that pot is dry first before I start in on this. So I want to work in an area that's dry. So I have some cast shadows that are overlapping each other, and where the cast shadows overlap each other, it does create a darker shadow or a darker shape. You should think of shadows as transparent sort of layers of color that lie on top of objects. So they should still reflect the color that they're on top of. So I still want that red to show through. But when you have two cast shadows that overlap each other, now you've got two layers of a shadow on top of each other, which is going to make them darker. And then also, too, remember that a cast shadow should get darker as it gets closer to the object that's creating it. So that's another thing that I'm going to focus on while I'm working on these cast shadows. And I'm going to go, primarily going to use my round brush at this stage because a lot of the areas of the cast that I'm going to be painting on right now are sort of smaller. So basically on my cast shadows, I have my lightest cast shadow already established. So some of this won't get changed at all. So all I'm doing is just going through and trying to figure out what needs to be darker and laying down darker washes of that indigo blue in those areas. Now again, this particular area that I'm working in right now where the two cast shadows overlap, they're creating a really defined shape. So I need to make sure that this entire area around where I'm working is dry. So I'm going to let that big overlapped shape in the middle of my painting dry. And while that's drying, I'm going to go and find other areas of my cache shadow that need to be darker. Again, my goal right now at this stage is just to create some more variation in my cache shadows. After I get some contrast and variation established in my cache shadows, I'm going to give my cache shadows a chance to dry, and then I'm going to go back in and I'm going to start dealing with that curved corner that I've been ignoring and that top rim. Again, I can't work on those areas of the pots until the stuff around it is dry. Which it should be by the time I get some more darker values established. All right, so I'm ready to start working on those two edges on each one of the pots I've been ignoring. I'm going to again start with my lightest indigo blue first. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm just really going to, again, pay attention to each pot's individual characteristic and what those edges need to look like. So I'm going to go back and start with my largest pot first. And I'm going to look at my still life for the answers to my questions. Now, if I start to notice that I lose the edge instead of see it, then that's telling me that I do not have enough contrast between those values in that particular area. So that's when I will look at my still life and ask myself, why do I see that edge? Which one, what side of this edge is lighter and what side of this edge needs to be darker? Whatever the answer is to that question, that's what I'm going to do to the painting to finish it and to fix it. So what I'm doing, because each one of my curved edges, no part of them needs to be white, I'm just filling in each one of those curved edges with just that light wash of indigo blue. So I'm going to let that dry. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start working on the top rim of the pot. Now, parts of this do need to stay white. So I want to look at the top rim and ask myself, what needs to stay white? That's where I'm not going to go. I'm going to avoid those areas. And I'm also going to look to see where the darkest part of those rims are. So on this front plane, it's the back edge that's pretty dark. And I've kind of made it a little bit too dark. So I'm just going to kind of re-wet that area and just try to pick up a little bit with my paper towel. I'll probably end up making it darker anyway, so probably should have just left it the way it was. And again, I'm just going to take that light wash of indigo blue, that lightest wash that I have, and I'm just going to paint that where I need it on the top rim. You will notice that some of the leaves of your plants are putting cache shadows on top of that top edge. So look for those opportunities. Those are great if you can find those. So when you look at your plant, the areas where the leaves are going past and over top of the edge of your planter or the pot, that's where you're going to have a cache shadow, because that leaf is going to block the light from that top edge, creating a cache shadow on top of it. So that's something you could just automatically do, is take a light wash of indigo blue and paint it on top of that top edge where you know there's a leaf on top of it. Hopefully that didn't sound too confusing. So now that I've got that curved corner started, I can't forget that there's also reflective red at the bottom of those. So I'm going to go ahead and take a light wash of that red and paint it at the bottom of that curved edge. And you should start to see, after we do that, you should start to see that all parts of your pot are kind of coming together and they feel unified. And then at that point, really what it's going to be all about is just establishing enough contrast to show form. So get that reflective red painted at the bottom of those curved corners. Again, each pot, you should treat each pot differently. So, you know, you might see more red on one versus another. And again, what we're doing is just, you know, going back and forth between the pots and the cast shadow, giving the paper a chance to dry between these areas. And then just adding more, you know, darker washes of that indigo blue where we need more contrast. So I'm going to go ahead and take, you know, a darker wash of this indigo blue, add some more to my front plant here, or the planter pot, whatever you want to call it. And our goal isn't just to show 3 different values. I mean, I'd say, you know, go for 4 or 5. The more you have, the better your painting's going to look, and the more form your painting's going to have. So I'm going to take this dark wash of indigo blue and pop it in places where it needs to go on each one of these pots. And again, you know, just because we're dealing with shadows, it doesn't mean that they're always going to blend or transition out seamlessly. So some of these shadows make really defined shapes. So if that's what you see, then that's what you want. It's not always going to be about blending. And again, if you're confused as far as what you should be doing, the answers to all your questions is sitting in front of you. It's called the still life. Now, if you're going through and you're painting in areas and you're like, ooh, I can't see that edge, again, that's an issue all about contrast. So if you lose an edge, it's because you don't have enough contrast between one value and another. So you just got to go through and ask yourself what needs to be darker. It's not going to be both parts. It's going to be one. Now these curved corners, I do see some smaller shapes kind of happening around the edges of them. So I'm going to paint those in. Again, some of these shadows are creating some defined shapes. You see them, plug them in. And if you need defined shapes, remember you should be painting on dry paper. If you're painting on wet paper, that color is just going to kind of blend out. And again, if you know, if you're having a hard time kind of seeing where I'm going with this, you can see my finished demonstration up on the board. The painting that you see up on the board is the one that I have in this demonstration video. Now, of course, I didn't actually finish the entire thing because it was a demonstration. So I don't have two of my plants painted in. So just keep that in mind. And again, you know, once I get a feeling for, like, you know, when I'm laying down color or value and it's not really doing anything, or I see that the paint is kind of blending out too much, then again, that's the painting's way of telling me I need to stop probably working in that area and give it a chance to dry and maybe work on something else. And again, if you have, hopefully you've noticed that since this video has started, other than at the beginning when I was talking about what we were going to be doing, I've been painting constantly. I haven't stopped. So if I'm not painting in an area, you know, if I need to give these pots a chance to dry, that doesn't mean I'm going to sit here and stare at my painting for 15 minutes watching paint dry. I'm going to go find something else that I need to work on in the painting. So I'm going to use all the time that I have and be productive with it. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my really small brush, my number 1 round brush, and I'm going to take dark indigo blue. So I'm actually getting this paint from my straight paint indigo blue, and I'm going to paint right at the very bottom of my pot, basically under it. I am going to paint a thin line of really dark indigo blue right here. So remember what we've talked about is that a cast shadow should be the darkest towards, or should be getting darker towards the object that's making it. So the darkest part of a cast shadow should be right under that object making that cast shadow. So I'm going to take my thin brush and a little bit of that really dark straight indigo blue, and I'm going to paint it right under, not on the pot, but right under the pot where that cast shadow is starting. And that's a really neat little detail to add in your painting that's going to help make those pots look like they're sitting on top of the paper. So it's going to ground them. So again, this really dark indigo blue is going to go right under the pots where those cast shadows are. And I'm going to do this to each one of those pots. And you don't want a ton of paint on your brush when you do this. So we want it to be kind of thin. And again, that's going to just create some nice dimension to it. So for the rest of this video, you know, I'm getting towards the end of it. You know, am I finished with this? Absolutely not. Do I still have more work to do? Yes. I still need to make my cast shadows look darker as they're getting closer to the objects. I need to add more variation into them. I need to build up contrast in areas. But again, I've got a good start on it. So really what we're talking about is just finishing touches in these particular areas from this point on. So that's what I'm going to work on. You guys have the rest of the class period, whatever time we have left, to continue to build up your darker values, add more variation, build up your contrast between your cast shadows and your pots. But keep working on that. And the next video that we're going to, or the next area of the paint that we're going to work on then is how to paint the rocks, and then how to paint the background. And then after that, we should have paint in all areas, and we'll be talking about finishing touches. So use the rest of your time wisely, and get your painting in a good place.